Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Truth Behind Transformation podcast. I'm your host, Akshay Panse. I'm the co-founder of Cloobot Inc. In this podcast series, I'll be speaking with leaders from consulting, enterprise technology, and AI to understand what really happens inside complex transformation programs. So this series is for CIOs, transformation leaders, implementation partners, business analysts, project managers. So anyone who has ever been part of a project where the team has worked really hard, the meetings happened, the documentations were created, the ticket moved forward, and yet somewhere along the way, the final outcome did not match what the business truly needed. So I also want to share why this topic is a bit personal to me. So before Cloobot, I was building a no-code platform for the construction industry. At the time, I thought the hardest part would be technology, but I was wrong. The harder part was understanding what people actually wanted. So my team would spend weeks speaking to different stakeholders, listening to their needs, documenting their requirements, configuring those workflows, and everyone tried their best. The teams were able to conduct the workshops very efficiently. And yet, when the build phase started, there was always a gap between what was being built versus what was being intended. And that gap always stayed with me. So the thought was that why does this happen that even with smart people involved, this kind of issues happen? Why do these requirements keep changing and why is it so hard for people to articulate their requirements? So in many ways, this podcast is my search for those answers. So without much further ado, I'm really excited to welcome our guests for today, Shankar Ramanathan. Quick background about Shankar. Shankar is currently the Vice President for Industry Solutions at Ness Digital Engineering. He has spent a decade working at the intersection of AI, data, analytics, and enterprise transformations, having worked at leadership roles in companies like Capgemini, Experience, FICO, and Infosys. What I find really valuable about Shankar's experience is that he doesn't look at AI or transformation just as a technology conversation. His work has always been close to real operations across banking, such as fraud, collections, workflow automation. And that makes him the right person to help us explore today's topic. What really happens inside complex transformation programs and why enterprise IT projects fail without decision context. So please welcome to the show, Shankar.
Thank you. Thanks, Akshay. Good afternoon.
So I'll try to keep this very conversational and please share anything from your experience. So the first topic which comes to my mind is that you have been close to so many large transformation projects. So in your experience, where do these things usually begin to go off track?
It's a very pertinent question. In fact, the answer is pretty much the first step. So large transformation programs start, right? And you're not changing one system. You're changing multiple systems across a company. Each system could be sitting in different parts of, in terms of the data owners, in terms of system owners, in terms of business owners, in terms of functional owners like risk, compliance, it could be your contact center force. So it could be multiple different people. So any large transformation worth its name is going to span across multiple parts of the organization. And majority of these large organizations we are talking about are matrixed in nature. So you're going to have such a large fertile matrix of number of people, number of stakeholders, number of decision makers. So the minute you have such a large number of people, you also have to remember another thing. As the transformation program starts, there is like also a time lapse between the beginning and probably even 3 to 4 or 5 months before which things kind of settle down and the execution starts. In this period where basically the discovery is happening, requirements are being kind of put together, there are also organizational transformations going at the same time. There is some rejig in terms of people changing, responsibilities changing, reorg of the company itself happening at the same time. So imagine people coming in, going out, a lot of these changing, plus priorities changing. Now, when you start the program, you basically had A, B, C, D as priorities. Market conditions are changing. So you're going to have also changing priorities in terms of, I want to get A, B, C done at the, say, for example, in January, and by the time you move towards April, I want A and B done in a particular way, and C, we will park for later, and D has now come in as a new requirement. So this kind, in any large transformation program, this is very basically this kind of a very transient nature of requirements with timelines, people, the organizational matrix, and the number of people involved. The sheer complexity of just carrying all of these things is the first place where things start beginning going off track. In my experience, I've done multi-country implementations across 14 countries for a large transnational bank. And it took us like 7-8 months to actually come to a baseline to have everybody agree to things. And imagine going through all the different parts of the bank, all the different businesses of the bank, all the different countries of the bank, and the central group, which is also trying to get this program actually done. So now imagine this is where basically things start going wrong. It's very, very complicated in terms of structure, in terms of the rate at which things move. And what I'm talking about is probably like 2010, 2011. So you can imagine with today's tools, at least you can do a slightly better job of things. Imagine doing this in 2010 and having to go through all of that, and even coming to a base business requirements document took us like 7-8 months. And by that time, people's understanding of what I wanted of the original program has actually changed.
Correct.
And by the time you come up with the business requirements document, some people are happy, some people are not, and the sign off takes a lot of time itself. So your question was, where does it go off track? I think the very first step in terms of discovery, requirements, getting everybody to agree that this is what we will be able to deliver, how are we going to break it into phases, that's the part where basically majority of the large transformation programs go off track. Does that answer your question?
That's very interesting. But one thing which kind of piqued my interest was you mentioned this was 2010. So do you think anything has changed now in 2026?
2010 to 26, the tools have changed. Now you have a lot more structured. We basically have agile methodologies that have basically come in. So that means people want answers and things to be dropped every 15 days. So now that's one complexity that's got added. Number two is basically more around the tools we are using. Now, JIRA has become mainstay. You've got recordings available much more frequently within teams. You have a lot more collaborative software that has happened. Now, yes, those have made things easier to record what's happening, but now it's also an explosion of information. So that also means there is more complexity in terms of having so many things happening over multiple times. When did we decide what? What happened earlier? What happened now? Versus who changed the decision? How did that change decision affect the other requirements? All of that interconnectedness of all these requirements have become a bit more difficult to manage. Like it's basically like saying you can code much faster now.
Yeah.
But you need to code the right thing fast. You can't code anything at a much rapid pace and then actually sit back and say, that's not what I want. So now with Agile, which is kind of an expectation today, that pushes you to a particular velocity in which you got to build and show what's available, what's the user experience and stuff like that. Now, on top of it, if you have white coding and people are basically starting to push things much faster, and then what if what you built does not actually, I mean, you do not agree with it. And in 2 months, a lot of things have changed. How are you going to manage the code change, the change management systems, all of the governance of the requirements itself becomes a much, much huger problem today. I would say 2010 had its own set of governance problems because of lack of tools. Today, the tools have made it easier and have also accelerated the number of problems you have. So that's the difference between 2010 and 26.
That's an interesting take. So in fact, one thing which I have seen hasn't changed much is that even this is something which I can relate to from my earlier startup, that businesses know the problem, but always struggle to explain exactly what they need. So why does that happen? What's the big challenge around it?
There is a big challenge, one in terms of saying, say, for example, terminologies are new now. Okay. Every day a new terminology comes in. Somebody says data mesh, data products. If your transformation program is around setting up a data mesh with data products, data owners. Now, technology understands these things. Some people who are at a different level of understanding are there. Versus the business, things in terms of business outcomes. They don't think in terms of the systems where the data is coming in. They don't think in terms of the vocabulary which people are using. I just gave the example of data mesh and data governance and data owners. That is just an example. Say, for example, if you had to take something around if AI-led transformation. Now, there is an old way in which people used to think, and the business owners have been constrained to think on certain lines because of old systemic constraints. They are aware of 20, 30 years of systemic constraints. And now they're saying, oh, we can only do this because the system doesn't allow me to do. Now, suddenly there is an AI transformation that comes up. They don't know what's possible. What they might think as a one-line thing could be like a very big requirement versus what they might think is like very difficult could actually be possible. So there is some bit of information asymmetry, I would say, between the business. The CIO office has to kind of play a role in terms of being the, what do you call, the brokers between business owners, business users, and the technology users, because they are moving at a much rapid pace. So you got to bring people to the same level. You have to explain things. And on top of it, like say, for example, given that technology is changing so fast, and you're trying to introduce things at that rapid pace, imagine. And you got the requirements from the business user 6 months or 9 months back, and suddenly agentic AI came across. And now your whole program has changed, and now you're trying to put in agentic AI. And the business users will say, I already explained my requirements to you. What do you want now? So these are kind of typical actual reality problems I'm actually looking at, because there was one of the programs where it was about data transformation. The business owners did not know, how do I give you requirements for a data product? So this is where business basically struggles because they don't speak the same language. They are not brought to the same level in terms of information. So this whole thing of somebody playing that middleman's role between the two sets of people who one thinks in terms of business outcome, another in terms of technology. And then there is a lot of these organizational constraints in terms of regulatory and other things. So different sets of information are in different brains of people in different corners. There needs to be that one central place where you're able to bring these things together and manage it and make people aware what you're talking about. This is what the other person means. So that central, you could call it a translation layer, that is kind of missing here. That's a very, very big problem, in my opinion, where business knows the problem, but struggles to explain what they need.
Yeah.
And they are basically trying to explain, but when they explain, they have certain old systemic constraints in mind. They come up with something. So these things keep moving, and this goes in cycles and circles. And with faster technology movements and change in vocabulary, it becomes all the more difficult. It was a slightly long-winded answer, but I think I'm trying to hit the nail.
That's very valid. So in fact, I keep hearing another aspect that on one side, the business users, what they actually say they want versus what they need, there's a delta there. So that's again one challenge. And then what they're conveying in a format or language is different than the kind of language which the technology team needs to then do the work further. And then, like you said, there are different stakeholders involved. So if at all there's a consultant involved, and then there is some conversations happen with the sales team, and then because of the very nature of the engagement, the sales team will have very limited time to capture that requirement. So they will have a very small picture of the need. They will then pass it on to the BAs and then the architects, who would then need to do further discovery. So they end up asking the same set of questions. So I can completely relate where this ball drop and this terminology change is going to create a snowball effect, derailing the whole initiative.
And plus, one program could encompass multiple systems, multiple off-the-shelf products, multiple homegrown products or homegrown applications that have been written. Now, it's the same business requirement that's driving all of it, from the data that's coming in, the application that's processing it, the decision that's being taken, the human in the loop, all of that stuff. But now that actually sits across 7 or 8 different systems, 4 or 5 different data sources. So now you're basically talking about breaking that into smaller chunks and then actually managing that requirement. And when some requirement changes, how these are all interconnected also kind of makes it much more complicated.
That's again very valid point, because one thing which we have also noticed is that during this entire process of discovery, the kind of information or the project truth is scattered across emails and then Teams, Slack, documents, spreadsheets, JIRA kind of platforms, and a lot of it in the heads of the BA. So in a world like this, how do you think it would affect decision making?
Well, absolutely. Not just across, say, you're right. It's basically some parts of it is captured in Jira. Some parts of it is captured in discovery workshops in terms of documents. Some of it is in a spreadsheet, in a PDF, in a deck. And there are multiple versions of those, and what's changing, they're constantly updating it as well. And on top of it, some of it is spoken but undocumented. It's like spoken but undocumented. Now, you have multiple such sources. Now, you have to understand, or we have to understand 2 or 3 things. How are these requirements related to each other? How does it form a typical, if you think of it like a graph, how are they actually interconnected is one of the things. Now, for that particular requirement, in these 2 meetings, the same issue was brought up, and there are transcriptions of those recordings, and then there is a document. Now, is someone triangulating these multiple sources and figuring out what was actually not in resonance, what was dissonant between these requirements? For the same requirement, you might actually have heard 3 different viewpoints, some of them directly in conflict with each other, right? So now, if you are able to bring in a single common requirements intelligence repository, I wouldn't call it a intelligence repository. I would say it's a central intelligence that sits, looks at all these call recordings, these documents, any previous recordings. It could be in Teams, it could be in SharePoint, it could be in multiple places where you're looking at with multiple versions, and how this thing is actually traced, like who changed, what kind of important decision was taken. All of this thing needs to give you a very governable, a very traceable, a central intelligence mechanism is needed for requirements so that things don't get dropped. Otherwise, what ends up happening is complete confusion, given that now today, say for example, one meeting, only 3 people are there. The other meeting, 8 people are there. And in between the roles, somebody took on the old role and somebody left, a new person has come in. How much of it is lost in so many such translations? Who is going to read all these requirements and keep them up to date? So if we can bring something that is a living, intelligent system that keeps track of all of this, how they are related, where it came from, how did it change, what were the significant decisions, who needs to be actually said, oh, please take a look at this kind of inconsistencies in requirements. That kind of an intelligent central system needs to be in place. And I think that is the need of the hour, in my opinion.
So one of the things I could actually correlate to this with regards to the point you made around triangulating different information elements. There was this client who mentioned a particular project they were involved in, where during the discovery sessions, the stakeholder, one of the stakeholder mentioned that the pricing logic will be as per what's in SAP. And then somewhere down the line, maybe workshop 20 or 30, whatever that count was, some other stakeholder mentioned that the sales team has the right to override and dictate their own pricing terms. And this kind of is completely contradicting or conflicting with what was earlier captured. And by the time it came to the next stage of the architect taking over, and this was something which was kind of a crack in the wall. and nobody really was able to triangulate and say that what is the actual way of progressing. So the architect had to then again take appointment of the stakeholders, do the round of discovery, and an unnecessary week or two was spent kind of extending the project timeline. So at least as of today, all of these are getting scattered, and that actually is again curious to say that do you see any evolution in project management tools or any other tools like people are using PPM dashboards, they are using Confluence like platforms. So is there any evolution in these platforms to take care of the kind of challenges we have been talking about?
Yes and no. So if you take JIRA, they're infusing AI so that you can talk to the JIRA tickets and find things. But kind of a functionality where you go, you ask a question, assumes you know what's the problem. Okay.
Yeah.
You can't go and ask a very generic question to it saying, point out all the inconsistencies in requirements for, and then you'll have to say which specific requirement. It has to then go search for those things and then find out, right? Instead, if the central requirements is basically kind of centrally taking, that system is taking care of how interconnected these requirements are. And now these requirements were gathered from this call recording on this date, this call recording on this date, this particular document, and this configuration in SAP, say, for example, 4 different sources from where I actually gathered this requirement. That graph kind of a maintenance is there. And there it actually says, now that I know these are the 4 things, let me now find out what are the inconsistencies. Like, say, the example you gave. On one end, it says we will take everything from SAP. On another end, somewhere in the call recording, it said sales can override. Then the question to be asked in that particular case intelligently would be, in what cases can sales override? How
Correct.
much they override? What levels of sales users are there and who can override how much? Now, these kind of intelligent questions need to be kind of surfaced. And for that, if the centralized intelligence systems takes care of this thing and maybe not ask all the right question, but at least hands it to a central requirement architect, if you would, just part of the term, I just made up something like a requirement.
Yes.
That person is looking at it and says, okay, now these are all there. Now, system actually alerts and says, for this particular node, I have found ABC inconsistencies. I want, and it kind of gives you an orange alert or a red alert or a green alert or green, this thing saying things seem to be okay. Do you say it's okay? So there needs to be that human in the loop, that kind of a person who basically looks at these things, but that human being cannot be looking at every single recording. It just becomes too much energy wasted across multiple windows and context switching, which makes your productivity very, very low. Instead, if the system is intelligent and it actually tells me these are the inconsistencies, these are the places where you need to actually take a look at and ask these questions to these different people. And it could be like the system telling you, can you send an email out to the relevant people who attended those meetings? And then it sends out email and then says, can we find out something intelligently in terms of their calendar, book something, quickly have that call, very pointed, saying, this is the question, I want this answer. Do we need to actually discuss? Can we get an okay on this? And then there is governability, there is traceability. All of that things comes into place. A very structured approach is required instead of the ad hoc nature in which the project truth today is kind of managed. So instead of project truth management, I would want a more structured, intelligent, governable, and controlled project truth management. That basically might be the big solution to this problem, in my opinion. Sorry, you're saying something.
Yeah, so I was saying it's very true. In fact, even if these current set of tools evolve, at the very DNA of these tools, so for example, if you look at JIRA, it was meant to be a system of record for the task. So you always know that what stage you are in, how you are progressing, are you on track or not. But it is never meant to manage or look at creating a system of record for the intent, the business logic. So I think fundamentally that's the gap which leads to all this chaos.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Those things assume that the requirements and the intent and the context has been properly captured. It has not changed over time. So those are the assumptions that these tools are making. And in today's world, with so many people picking up, talking and so much conversations happening, change of context, loss of business meaning across multiple owners, systems, information, data sources, governance and regulations, all of these things put together, you have like a melee of things. And none of the existing tools, in my opinion, actually takes care of the intent of these requirements and ensure that there is traceability. Because majority of the time, there is going to be a lot of blame game that happens, and that kind of takes 2-3 months of your project away in just the political part of it. Rather, if it's all centralized in one place, it's much, much easier for somebody to manage.
And the irony is that today everybody talks about AI and that there's so much of automation. But the irony is that the most critical phase, which is discovery, the most of those requirements are still being managed on spreadsheets. So I think definitely there needs to be a kind of a new age system to address this fundamental gap.
Absolutely. That's something which I completely believe in. And I would say with the rapid pace of development, agile methodology, and the rate at which people are kind of forced, you can't do programs over 3 years nowadays. You need to deliver things at a much faster pace. And things are changing on a daily basis, a weekly basis, within a quarter, things are changing. With all this rapid change, pace of change, I believe if you do not centralize this part of the phase of project execution in terms of discovery and requirements, I think there's going to be much more chaos.
Absolutely. So because now if AI is now helping you build faster, but you end up building in the wrong direction, the loss and the impact will be much more chaotic. So couldn't agree more with you. So in terms of even transformation, like now a lot of companies are trying to leap from those legacy applications to now the new age AI systems. So is there something fundamentally which they need to correct before they kind of switch to a new technology? So is there a gap which you think needs to be addressed before this?
Absolutely. Say, for example, the minute you're going from some legacy technology, multiple systems which are legacy, or maybe you are just consolidating different parts of your consumer lifecycle applications from legacy systems, right? When this thing happens, many times the requirements, they will say, look at the existing system and give me information, right? The problem would be when you are moving to, say, for example, I'm just giving an example here in terms of it needs to be a cloud native application. So now, why are you moving to cloud? Because scaling in specific areas will be easier instead of treating it as a monolith application. You break it into 10 services, say, for example. Only 2 of them have very, very high requirements in terms of scalability. Do you want to like replicate all 10 modules? No, you don't want to scale so much. That's a waste of compute resources. So cloud gives you a particular reason why you can scale specifically for some services. And that's the reason why microservices and other architectures came into place. So now when you're moving in the direction of transformation, one thing leaders need to understand is, yes, I'm going to move from old to the new way of making things happen. I should not carry the old dead wood in terms of how I used to do earlier was limited by systemic constraints of the old applications. Do I want to port all of that old to the new as well? Then I'm kind of making the same mistakes again. So I don't want to do that. So again, the intent of that requirement and overriding the systemic limitation of the past, all of that has to come into place. Now you have to understand what I'm trying to do, what I was not able to do because of the old stuff, and now because of the new stuff, what I can do. These 3 things kind of become very important here. Now, if you're able to manage that centrally, have that clear conversation and record it very clearly what we want to build, that is when your transformation programs are going to be successful. Majority of the time, they will say, oh, I don't have the budget for doing that. We will do a lift and shift right now, and then we will change it from there. That's one fallacy which I see leaders have to start accepting it's not working anymore. People have to like really think in terms of you know what, I don't want to take lift and shift anymore. It's kind of very, very difficult. Yes, I want to lift and shift 70% of that application with these requirements. These parts of the legacy, I want to redesign it. You need to be very clear in your head. And again, for that, you have to manage the discovery, the business intent part of it very clearly. And the other thing is transformation wise, if you have to look at it, earlier you had systems which did not talk much to each other. The integration was kind of very weak. Today, when people look at requirements, they have to start looking at where the data comes in, and then it moves into some place where you actually calculate machine learning models, features, use those models, drive decisions downstream. Because unless you operationalize it, now this entire traceability of data to events, to decisions, to operational systems actually receiving it across the board, you might be talking 3 or 4 systems, 4 or 5 off-the-shelf products. And being able to manage it as a program rather than as a small project in each one of them is another issue which people do not realize how complicated this is. They look at it as a piecemeal thing. Say, if I'm having 5 transformation happening in the company today, if I have one central place where I manage all of these requirements, I understand it better. I can manage all this. This entire transformation program will be much more successful.
Yeah.
I'm just giving an example. If you're a bank and you have an origination system which you're modernizing, you have a transaction monitoring system, you have a fraud AML investigation system, you have a core banking, and you are kind of modernizing like multiple pieces of this. But you have to remember the same data is flowing from top to bottom through the consumer lifecycle. And one requirement upstream changes things downstream as well. So having one single place in which all your requirements is managed is also an important thing. So people have to start in understanding the nature of transformation today with AI. With AI, intelligence is coming across multiple data sources, across multiple systems. So then that means your requirements also have to be much more centrally managed. That's another important thing which I hope leaders start accepting in terms of transformation.
Actually, that's very true. So, in fact, one of the points which even I am now thinking based on your inputs is that the discussions which happen during these workshops, that actually becomes an IP of the enterprise. And for some weird reason, I don't know why there is a gap, but nobody has really thought of how can this information be stored in a more systematic way, in a manner where they can own that IP, leverage it for other transformation initiatives. So they are buying JIRA for the very much same in purpose from a task perspective, where they have the ownership of the task, where they are able to keep a traceability and tracking of where the project is. But for some reason there is a gap where there is no system of record for this particular intent. And in your opinion, how can the organization, if such a system of record for the intent is maintained, all the process know-how is maintained, how can they leverage it for unlocking other initiatives?
Definitely, CC. Example, once you have understood the intent behind how you're doing things, say today, for example, you came up with like some data products and you are selling certain things today based on what is happening today, right? Now, going forward, people want to monetize their data furthermore. Using this same IP, if you have it centralized, can you think of future possibilities? You could. Another thing, if you have the same set of regulatory constraints, tomorrow a new innovation or innovative thought comes up. Are you in a position to like enter it into that central brain of that entire requirement system and then be able to like say, you know what, you're actually missing out on this particular piece. This IP, what you called as the organizational IP, need not be just how the company works. It could be constraints because of regulation. It could be constraints because of organization. It could be the way in which data is collected, where there is inefficiencies. And you might say, you know what, this will not work because of these reasons. So having to kind of think through and maintain it as a centralized IP instead of multiple documents, multiple meetings, and then synthesizing it into a central intelligence layer will actually help companies think in a very, very different way in terms of looking at new opportunities to monetize their data, looking at new opportunities to come up with new services, how to make their processes much more efficient. Like say, for example, I redefined the origination process.
Yeah.
You can then basically say, can I, on these same lines, can I redefine my collection processes? Can I redefine my fraud processes? What did I learn in the first one, which I can apply here? Instead of being dependent on people, you now can go into a centralized intelligence system. And that's very, very specific to your enterprise instead of something which is global. Like the LLMs do some job of telling you the global information today. But what these companies need is actually something that sits within the enterprise, holds all that information as an intelligence system. So you could use it in multiple different ways. It's a very, very interesting thought that you have, and I see a lot of value in that. And I hope people actually start thinking on those lines and adopt these kind of these things. People have to, the leaders in terms of all the transformation offices will need to start thinking in terms of how to manage these centralized. How am I going to take care of all my AI projects? Now, I used AI in a particular way in one of the transformation projects. Is it applicable in other projects? Those kind of things can very, very quickly be used. Instead of depending on a human being or like a small team, you are kind of making it your own organizational intelligence rather than depending on people.
Correct.
And humans will be required. Humans will still be required. Don't get me wrong. It is about augmenting the team that's actually working on this and not depending on their individual diligence. You are basically bringing in the diligence at an organizational level and augmenting the human to take the decision and actually take the right decisions across multiple projects in terms of managing requirements.
So that really connects with the heart of the series, in fact. So thank you so much for the thoughtful conversation. What I'm taking away from this is that transformation does not usually fail because people cannot build. It often fails because the original intent slowly gets lost across all these myriad of complexities. And maybe that is the truth behind transformation. Before we rush to build faster, we need to understand better. So thank you again for sharing your time, your experience, and your perspective. I hope everyone listening really found something valuable. Thank you everyone for joining us on the truth behind transformation. Thank you all and have a good day.